2 years ago this month, the last American troops pulled out of Britain's most notorious airbase, Greenham Common. It was the end of an 11-year saga which turned a sleepy Berkshire airfield into one of the most controversial missile sites in Europe. During the 1980s, Greenham Common was the centre of a fierce fight between the supporters and the opponents of nuclear weapons. Now, the silos which once housed 96 nuclear missiles are empty. But peace has not returned to Greenham. Today, there's an increasingly bitter row between the Ministry of Defence and the people of nearby Newbury over how the airbase should be used in the future. Peace women still camp at the gate, determined to keep Greenham a living symbol of the fight against nuclear weapons. In the first of a two-part investigation, we examine Greenham Common's controversial history.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to make a statement about ground-launched cruise missiles. Greenham Common will be the main operating base and will house 6 flights of missiles. It is planned that the first units will deploy at Greenham Common in 1983.
It was 14 years ago, in July 1980, that the prosperous market town of Newbury in Berkshire suddenly found itself in the front line of the Cold War between the superpowers. The people of Newbury were told that American troops would be arriving at the airfield, which lies to the south of the town, bringing with them the very latest weapons of mass destruction. Few at the time understood what they were playing host to. The arrival of cruise missiles in Europe marked a new stage in the Cold War. Small, maneuverable missiles, each with the destructive power of 5 Hiroshima bombs.
The potency of these cruise missiles lies in the fact that they're very small, difficult targets to hit. They fly very fast, about the speed of a rifle bullet. Flying below the radar, very difficult to detect. If the enemy sees them, it's difficult to shoot them down. Without having a human pilot aboard, the missile is fearless. It can fly a riskier mission, and then at the end of it all, it's packing a punch.
The deployment of cruise was part of a NATO decision in the late 1970s to update the West's nuclear capability. The nuclear missiles destined for Greenham Common were designed to be launched from the back of giant transporters. In the event of hostilities, they would leave their base and, as the Ministry of Defence said at the time, quietly melt into the countryside. As the implication of the decision sunk in, it split the local community from top to bottom. Among those horrified by David Fry was a Newbury councillor in the 80s. He welcomed the Americans.
I thought it was wonderful to have the Americans back here once again. Personally, it was very, very important to know not only myself would be protected, but my children and grandchildren. I thought back to the early days of the war, the last World War, when we had nothing to fight anybody with. And to think that the Americans had come here once again to protect us was a wonderful thought and comforting.
The Americans first came to RAF Greenham in the final years of World War II, when the United States joined the Allied war effort.
Okay, RAF, if we can fit your boots, we'll walk it straight, brother.
In those days, Greenham Common was little more than a flat area of heathland, one of a number of empty pieces of land taken over by the RAF at the beginning of the war.
At the red line,
For the incoming American servicemen, Britain was a strange place.
£1 is not $1, but $4.
and that equals 20 shillings. 1 shilling equals 12 pennies, which equals 20 cents.
On the eve of D-Day, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, visited his troops stationed in Berkshire.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
Greenham Common has remained an airbase ever since. For most of its history, it's been leased to the Americans, who systematically created their own little piece of America in the south of England.
Run it out, Mark! Run it out! Run it out! You're on. Come on, guys. We gotta make plays like that. I wasn't even hard. Now let's go.
We had our basics change, which is where clothes and shoes and all that, and the stereos and stuff, equipment that we could buy.
Skip Hensley was one of the hundreds of US servicemen who served at Greenham Common in the 1970s, when it was still a quiet backwater.
We had the petrol station up there where we'd get our fuel. In the commissary, you had rations you had to use in there to get certain items, like cigarettes and stuff like that. But yeah, they had everything on base. They said it was American, but I was wondering, how did they fly all that stuff over here, you know?
It was so much a piece of America that even the US dollar reigned supreme. But all changed in 1983 when cruise missiles were flown in direct from the United States aboard giant Galaxy transport planes. They brought with them a new generation of bewildered Americans, many of them Vietnam veterans, who had only the vaguest idea of where they were going.
I was thinking I was going to Building Hall or Upper Hayford or an air base. Then when they came back and said, you're going to Greenham Common, I mean, a lot of us said, what is Greenham Common? You know. It was a trip. 3 weeks to find out, what is Greenham Common? What's a RAF?
The incoming airmen remained largely unaware of the political storm which was gathering around them.
There was a few ladies that we seen camping outside the base around the back. See, our dorms was in the back of the base, and they were camping around the back of the base and stuff. We've seen a few, but they never really, at that time, never really gave us any bother or any trouble or anything.
But within months, the storm clouds had burst, and Greenham Common was on the front page of the world's media. The demonstrations that followed were unparalleled in recent British history.
Lose the political debate. We should be keeping an eye on what was actually happening in there so that we knew what was going on. Women were doing that. We watched the silos being built. We tried to speak to the contractors.
As the protest spread, makeshift camps sprung up around the base. It became a women-only protest. At times, law and order was on a knife edge. Residents of the area didn't know what had hit them.
I was a very angry man. I was a councillor for Greenham at the time, and it got really naughty towards the end when they put a scaffolding up on the main gate and they had an effigy of me hanging round my neck.
I think some local residents got to the point where they could no longer see us as individual human beings, and they would not count.
Time after time, the women cut their way into the base, sometimes through 3 layers of razor wire, causing intense embarrassment to the military authorities who seemed powerless to stop them getting into even the most sensitive areas.
I went into the base more times than I can remember. The silos always, I suppose because they were where the missiles were stored and where the greatest amount of security was, always held a certain fear and a certain fascination. I remember one sunny afternoon there were a lot of women down and we decided that we would go for the silos in broad daylight. That was very eerie because it's very empty, and we went actually inside of the buildings and sort of walked around. It was almost like the silos became the focus of everything in the base. Suddenly you would have cars and vans and everyone screeching because, of course, it was the secure area of the base.
For US serviceman Bill McGee, who now runs a hamburger stall in Newbury, the whole business was baffling. The Americans were told to keep well out of it.
Well, the way the CND was coming on with the demonstration, it was almost like a little war. I mean, you put up a fence, we're going to tear it down, and technically it was between the MOD, the British government, and the CND. I mean, our job was to build a base, not to decide how it was to be used or whatever.
And this is what they told you before you came?
That's my job. That's always been my job. I build bases.
Did they describe it as a war? Was it? I mean, that's how they described it to you, was it? Did they describe it as a...
Well, you would think it was a war the way people were fighting. Kind of touch and go there for a while.
The Ministry of Defence sent in British troops to reinforce the garrison. They formed a thin cordon just inside the fence. Life for the women outside became increasingly primitive and squalid, the result of a deliberate policy by Newbury District Council to make things difficult. The authority employed teams of bailiffs to break up the camps, sometimes up to 5 or 6 times a day. It turned into a brutal, degrading and ultimately futile routine. The camps did not go away.
I saw...
But the authorities had other problems to deal with. In 1984, 1 year after the arrival of the first cruise missiles, American troops embarked on a series of routine night exercises designed to test the missiles' ability to melt into the countryside. The rehearsals became a focus of the campaign by peace protesters who tracked them and harried them.
There's a motorcyclist going... We're slowing down. They're holding us back again. I can't see any of the convoy vehicles now, only the police.
The demonstrators were routinely stopped from following the convoy. They staged impromptu demonstrations along the roadside. The campaigners were in radio contact. When one group was blocked, another was alerted further down the road.
Do you copy?
I copy you.
Well, I'm Parkhouse Hill and the convoy's just arrived and we've just lit the flares.
We would...
Peace campaigners have always argued that the ease with which they tracked the cruise convoys undermined the whole principle on which they were based. If they could, then so could a determined enemy.
The so-called Achilles heel of the cruise missile, that the protest movement could monitor where these missiles are being moved around to and therefore negate their secrecy, is probably not grounded in truth, because in a wartime situation, the clamps would come down, people wouldn't be allowed to follow them around, people wouldn't be allowed to communicate information about where they were. So I think this was strictly a byproduct of the peacetime situation and wouldn't have removed the potency of the weapon in wartime.
What did remove them was a political earthquake in the then Soviet Union and an historic nuclear weapons accord signed by the Soviets and the Americans in 1987, the so-called INF Treaty. Under it, both sides agreed to substantial reductions in nuclear weapons. The removal of cruise missiles from Europe was part of that deal. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But it wasn't until 1992 that the last of the American troops were flown out. They left behind them a giant headache. They left behind an unsafe, unusable tract of land, a ghost town of derelict buildings and a memory of a former alliance. They left a blast-proof communications complex with its dozens of operation rooms. Once these rooms were crammed with space-age technology. Now they're just empty real estate. At the center lies the control room, where in times of war the missiles would have been clinically dispatched around the globe. It's now all been handed back to the Ministry of Defense, an airbase the Americans don't want and the British don't need. But today, Greenham Common has become the center of a more immediate, localized conflict. Local people who've lived with it for 50 years as an airbase want it restored to public open space, Newbury's own piece of heathland. We look at the simmering row between the Ministry of Defence and the residents of Newbury, why Greenham is still in conflict.